You were never in love with them. You were in love with who you needed them to be. There is a specific kind of evening that happens after certain conversations. You are not replaying what was said because it was cruel. Nothing cruel happened. The other person was warm or at least courteous. They smiled. They said things that sounded like the right things. And still you drove home with something sitting wrong in your chest, and now, 3 days later, you are lying in the dark doing it again, going back through it word by word, looking for the moment you missed. You didn't miss a moment. You refused one. It was there, small and clear, a sentence that didn't quite land the way it should have, a way they deflected when something real came close, a look that passed too quickly across their face. You noticed it. Some part of you registered it with the quiet precision of a body that already knows things the mind is still negotiating. And then, almost instantly, almost before the noticing was fully formed, you did what you always do. You found an explanation. You gave them a reason. You folded the inconvenient signal into a story that left the picture intact. This is not stupidity. It is not weakness. It is the specific intelligence of a person who has invested deeply enough in someone that the cost of really seeing them has become too high. The romanticization knows what it is protecting. It has always known. It overlooks strategically, surgically only what it needs to. 3 days later, alone, the investment has thinned enough that the explanation finally loses its grip. You hear the sentence again. You see the deflection again. And something shifts, not dramatically, not with revelation music, but with a quiet and slightly sickening thud of a thing settling into place. You weren't misreading them. You were misreading because it was easier. And now you can't unread what you've read. This moment, the replaying, the refusal, the delayed arrival of what was always there, is what we're here to look at. Not as a failure of perception. As a structure. One that has a name, a logic, an origin, and a cost you have been paying for longer than you know. There is a pattern some people carry through their relational lives without ever quite naming it. It goes like this. The beginning is electric. Extraordinary. There is a sense of recognition. The feeling that this person understands you, that they are someone you have been waiting for, that finally, here is a connection that will not disappoint. You lean in. You open. You give in ways you normally protect. And then the slow erosion begins. Not a dramatic betrayal, rarely that. Something quieter. A pattern of behavior that, if you're honest, you saw hints of early. A way of prioritizing that doesn't include you as much as you expected. A capacity for coldness that surprises you even though, in retrospect, the coldness was visible from the start, you simply chose not to see it. The intimacy you projected onto them begins to find its actual dimensions, and the actual dimensions are smaller than the ones you drew. The loss is real. It always is. But if you look closely at what you are mourning, something strange emerges. You are grieving a version of them that existed primarily in you. You didn't lose them. You lost the story you were telling about them. And the story was yours. This is the disorientation no one talks about clearly enough. Not the anger of betrayal. Betrayal at least gives you somewhere to put the pain. But this, the quiet vertigo of discovering that the person you fell in love with was partly real and partly a canvas. That you contributed something to them, something generous and hopeful and entirely imaginary, and that the contribution was so seamless you couldn't feel the seam. You have felt this probably more than once. There is a specific arc your closest relationships tend to follow. The arc is not random. It is not bad luck. And it is not, though it might feel this way, a result of the world being populated exclusively with people who are not who they seem. The arc is yours. The lens is yours. And until you look at the lens, the arc continues. Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens between human beings in the space that is supposed to be intimacy. What he found was not romantic. It was something stranger and more useful, that when we encounter another person we do not encounter them directly. We encounter them through a filter, an interior image, ancient and deeply personal, that we have been carrying long before we met them. Jung called this the projection of the unconscious. And what he was describing was not a pathology. It was the default condition of human relationship before a person does the specific kind of work that makes it otherwise. The image is not arbitrary. It is assembled from everything formative, the emotional texture of your first significant relationships, the needs that were met and the needs that weren't, the models of connection you absorbed before you had the language to question them. By the time you are old enough to choose people, you are already carrying a template. And when you meet someone who approximates the template closely enough, something in you lights up with a recognition that feels, from the inside, like love. But what it is, at first and sometimes for years, is resonance. The other person is vibrating at a frequency you already know. You feel seen. What has actually happened is that you have seen something in them that fits something in you. Jung wrote in The Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious, every projection is a bridge between the inner world and the outer one, but it is a bridge that leads away from reality rather than toward it. What he was pointing to here is specific and strange. The projected image doesn't just distort the other person, it actually connects you to something true about yourself. The romanticized version of them is a self-portrait. What you need them to be reveals exactly what you have not yet been able to own or accept or integrate in yourself. They become the container for your unlived material. And you protect that container furiously because losing it, seeing them as they are, would mean having to look directly at yourself. This is why the moment of clear seeing feels like loss. It is loss. But what you are losing is not them. You are losing a part of your interior life that you had disguised as a person. There was a woman, call her Elena, who had spent 15 years cycling through the same kind of friendship. She was good at intimacy, or believed she was. She knew how to listen, how to create safety, how to make a person feel seen within the first conversation. People were always drawn to her quickly. Friendships formed with an intensity that felt to her like finally, someone who gets it. Someone who operates at the same depth. Someone who will not settle for surface. It always started this way. And it always, with a predictability she had not yet made conscious, began to unravel around the 18-month mark. Not with a fight. Not with a betrayal. With a slow accumulation of small evidence that the person she had befriended was not quite who she had decided they were. The depth she had felt in those early conversations began to reveal itself as something more specific and more limited. The warmth she had read as unconditional began to show its conditions. The sense of being seen, which had felt so mutual, turned out to be a transaction. One that held as long as Elena was performing a certain role in their story and frayed when she stopped. She would grieve. She would withdraw. She would tell herself she had simply chosen poorly again, that she kept attracting the same kind of person, that there was something in her that drew people who were unavailable beneath their surface warmth. This was not entirely wrong. But it was not quite the truth either. The truth was something she had not yet been able to look at directly. The truth was that the intimacy she had felt in those early conversations was real, and hers. The depth she had experienced was genuine, and came substantially from her. She had walked into each friendship with a fully formed story about who this person was, a story assembled from hope and need and the specific longing of someone who had been lonely beneath her apparent sociability for years. The other person had provided some raw material. Elena had built the rest. And then, when reality provided evidence that the building was partly fictional, she had explained the evidence away for as long as she could. Until she couldn't. And then she called it the other person's failing. What Elena had never examined was this. The pattern was consistent across 15 years and multiple people who were, in fact, quite different from one another. The common factor in every one of those friendships was not a type of person. It was a way of seeing. A lens that created what it needed and then defended the creation. She had not yet understood that the problem was not her taste in people. It was that she had not yet been able to tolerate the ordinary reality of people who were flawed and limited and sometimes cold, because tolerating that would have required her to grieve something she had not yet agreed to grieve. The projection was not stupidity. It was a structure built to avoid a specific pain. And the price was this. Genuine intimacy, which requires seeing and being seen by someone actual, kept eluding her, because she kept replacing the actual people with the people she needed them to be. What Elena was living, Eric Fromm had named with precision decades earlier. Fromm drew a distinction between two modes of loving that most people experience as one. There is the love that requires the object to remain certain, to stay inside the frame you have built for them, to confirm the story, to not become fully themselves if that self is inconvenient. And there is something else, a love that can bear the full weight of another person's reality, that can hold them as they are, not as needed, that can survive the disappointment of their ordinariness without collapsing the whole structure. What Fromm was pointing to in The Art of Loving was that the second kind is not a more intense version of the first. It is a different practice entirely. It requires a specific kind of maturity, not emotional sophistication, not intelligence, not even life experience, but the willingness to let the other person be real. Fromm wrote of love as a discipline, not a feeling. A capacity that is developed, not discovered. Most people, he argued, understand love as something that happens to them, an experience that arrives, electrifying and unbidden, carrying its own authority. The problem is that what arrives in that rush of recognition is not love yet. It is the feeling of projection finding a target. Love, the actual thing, begins at the moment the projection starts to lift and you discover whether you can sustain your attention on the person who is actually there. Most relationships do not survive that transition. Not because the people in them are wrong for each other. Because one or both people cannot tolerate the downgrade from the idealized image to the real one. They experience the lifting of the projection as loss, and they are not wrong that something has been lost. What they cannot yet see is what might be gained. But here is the part that has been waiting beneath everything said so far. What if the projection is not a mistake you made? What if it is a defense that was, at some point, necessary? What if the reason you keep replacing real people with idealized ones is not a flaw in your character but a logic? A logic that has its own history, its own origin, its own terrifying coherence. The uncomfortable place this argument arrives at is not about the people you have chosen. It is about what you have not yet been able to afford to see. Because seeing people clearly, truly clearly, without the softening overlay of hope or need, requires something from you first. It requires that you be willing to sit with the disappointment of ordinary people. People who are sometimes petty. People who love imperfectly. People who cannot always give you what you most need, not because they don't care but because they are limited, which is to say, human. The projection is, among other things, a defense against that disappointment. Against the particular grief of needing more than the world can reliably provide. The illusion is not what you built to see them. It is what you built to avoid feeling small. This is the mirror held steadily. You were not passive in this. You were not simply deceived by people who presented themselves as more than they were. You participated. You populated them. You gave them qualities they possessed in seed and inflated those seeds into forests. You overlooked what contradicted the story because the story was doing something for you, shielding you from a grief or a longing or a fear that felt too foundational to survive contact with. The logic made sense. It was not irrational to need the projection. A child who needed more safety than their environment provided learned to see safety everywhere, learned to find it in the set of a person's jaw, in a certain quality of attention, in the promise of early warmth. The template was adaptive. It was assembled in conditions where the alternative to hope was something that could not be survived. You are not wrong for having built it. You are only wrong now in continuing to live by it as though those conditions still hold. Because those conditions no longer hold. You are not a child dependent on this person's goodwill for your survival. The grief of seeing them clearly will not kill you. It will feel like it might. It will feel for a moment like the floor is gone. But the floor is not gone. It is only that the story you were standing on was not the floor. Let yourself stay in that for a moment. The thing beneath the projection, the grief, the longing, the early wound that made it necessary, that is not a weakness you are discovering. That is the source. That is what has been driving the pattern. That is what you have been disguised from yourself in the figure of another person. All that searching, all those relationships, all that intensity in the beginning and slow deflation as reality reasserted itself, it was not a failure of connection. It was a search. A search conducted in the wrong direction, not because you were stupid but because the thing you were looking for was inside you all along and looking outward was the only way you knew how. Jung, taking this further than he stated in any single text, was pointing toward something radical. The real work of relationship is not to find someone who fits your interior image. It is to become curious about the image itself. To ask what it is you keep projecting. To follow the projection back to its source and discover what part of yourself you place there for safekeeping. Because once you can see the image as yours, once you can claim the qualities you were casting onto others, something strange happens. The compulsion to romanticize begins to loosen. Not because you have become cynical, but because you have become less desperate. You are holding more of yourself now and you need the other person to hold less. And here is where something unexpected opens. When the projection lifts, when you begin to see someone with the softening removed, you might assume what you will find is less. Less than the version you imagined. Smaller, flatter, more ordinary. This is the fear that keeps the projection in place. That without the overlay there is nothing worth seeing. But this is not what clear seeing delivers. What it delivers is something stranger and more textured. Because real people, seen without the need for them to be a certain thing, have a dimensionality that the idealized image never had. The idealized image is always a little flat. It is, in the end, a two-dimensional thing, a projection, which is to say, a surface. Real people are not flat. They have contradictions, unexpected depths, a specific history that shaped them in ways your template could not have predicted. When you stop needing them to be your story, you can begin to be curious about their actual one. This is what Fromm meant by mature love. Not that it is more disciplined or less passionate, but that it is directed at someone real. Someone with a history, a character, a set of limitations and a set of capacities that exist independently of what you need from them. Someone who cannot be contained in a projection because a projection is, by definition, smaller than a person. The loss of the romanticized version is real. Do not let anyone tell you it isn't. You grieve it. You should grieve it. The image you carried was built from your deepest hopes, and letting it go is letting go of something that mattered. But it is not the same as letting go of the person. In some cases, if they are willing, if there is enough of something real beneath what you constructed, it is actually the beginning of meeting them. For Elena, this understanding arrived slowly and without drama. It arrived in the middle of a friendship, her current one, her most recent attempt at the old pattern, when she caught herself for the first time, registering the dissonance instead of explaining it away. Something her friend did that was small and slightly cold. Elena noticed it. She waited for the explanation to arrive. And this time she didn't let it. She stayed with the dissonance. She felt the small disappointment of it. And then something shifted. Instead of withdrawing, instead of quietly beginning to grieve the friendship as already lost, she got curious. Not about why her friend had failed her. About what her friend might actually be carrying. About what it might feel like to be her friend. Someone with her own template, her own projections, her own unexamined interior. Elena stopped, for the first time in 15 years, making the friendship about the story she was living. She let it be about two actual people, imperfect and limited, doing their imperfect and limited best. The friendship did not become the one she had dreamed of. It became something better, real. The moment you stop romanticizing someone is not the moment you lose them. It is the moment you finally meet them. This is not a small thing. This is the entire thing. Because you have been grieving projected versions of people and calling it love, and the grief was real, but the love was aimed at a fiction. The actual people were always there, just past the image, waiting, not in the way of a grand destination, but in the ordinary and profound sense that people actually exist, with their own lives and their own interior, whether beyond the meaning you impose on them. What changes when you begin to see people clearly is not that you love less. What changes is that the love becomes possible in a way it has never quite been. Because real love, the kind that can last, the kind that has actual nourishment in it, is directed at someone who is actually there. And here is what you will discover, perhaps to your genuine surprise. Some of the people you have been projecting onto are, in their actual reality, more than the image you built. They have qualities you were too busy constructing a story about to notice. They have a particular way of being in the world that the romanticized version obscured rather than revealed, because the romanticized version was really about you. When you put that down, when you free them from the image, what is left is not less. In some cases, it is the beginning of something you have been searching for across all those years of beautifully lit disappointment. The willingness to see clearly is not pessimism. It is not a lowering of standards or an acceptance of less. It is the prerequisite of more. Of the only more that has any weight to it, more of what is actually real. You are not being asked to stop caring deeply. You are not being asked to protect yourself, to hold back, to love more carefully in the sense of loving less fully. You are being asked to direct the fullness at something that can receive it. At someone who is there. There is a question in all of this that you have perhaps been circling without asking it directly. And it is this: if you have been doing this, projecting, constructing, defending the construction, being disappointed, grieving the fiction, what does it mean for the people you have loved? Were the relationships real? Was any of it real? Yes, all of it. The love was real. The grief was real. The moments of connection, even within the projections, were real, because you were real in them even when the other person had become partly a canvas. The experiences happened. The tenderness was genuine. None of that is retroactively false. What is false is not the feeling but the object. Not the love but the specific story about who the other person was. And that story was always yours to own. This is the thing that moves the question from pain into something usable. The projection was never really about them. It was always about you. About what you carried, what you needed, what you had not yet been able to hold directly. Which means that the work, the real work, the work that changes the pattern, is not about choosing better people. It is about meeting your own interior. About finding out what it is you have been placing outside yourself and placing it back where it belongs. Jung's deepest insight about projection was not the mechanism, not the how of it, but the invitation contained within it. Every time you project a quality onto someone and are then disappointed by its absence, you have received information. You now know something you carry that you have not yet made conscious, that you have not yet integrated, that you are still sending out into the world hoping someone else will embody it so you don't have to. The question is, are you willing to take it back? Are you willing to hold the quality yourself, to discover it in yourself, to stop needing it to live in someone else? To stop romanticizing people is to start returning to yourself. This is the identity that waits on the other side of this work. Not a person who loves less or a person who has been burned enough to protect themselves, or a person who approaches new connections with the guarded wariness of someone who has been disappointed too many times, but a person who has become more real, who has more of themselves available, who brings something genuine to encounters with other people because they are no longer too busy projecting to actually be present, who can sit across from someone who is ordinary, limited, imperfect, who can see clearly that this is what they are, and love them without needing them to be otherwise, because the love is no longer built on a story. It is built on attention, on curiosity, on the willingness to keep looking at who is actually there and find, in what is actually there, more than enough. There is something in this that cannot be arrived at through deciding. You cannot simply choose to see people clearly the way you choose to take a different route to work. The projection does not release on command. What begins to shift is something more gradual, a developing tolerance for the dissonance, a growing ability to sit with the gap between who you hoped someone was and who they are showing themselves to be, without immediately filling the gap with a better story. It is a practice of staying slightly longer in the uncomfortable space of not knowing, of letting the picture develop at its own pace rather than developing it yourself in the dark room of your hopes. And what develops, in that slower light, is something you could not have planned for, an actual person, with all the interest and texture and genuine surprise of something real. If this arrived somewhere true for you, comment the word clear. Not as a declaration that you have finished this, as a claim of where you are beginning. The journey back to actual seeing is not the loss it looks like from here. It is the recovery of something that was never the other person's to carry, something that has always been yours, that you dressed in their features and their voice and their way of moving through a room, and sent out into the world on your behalf. When you call it back, you do not become emptier. You become more present, more yourself, more capable of the thing you were trying to create through the projection. Genuine contact, genuine recognition, the particular warmth of being seen by someone who is actually looking at you and not at the image they needed you to fit. You have been grieving projections and calling it heartbreak. Some of it was heartbreak. Some of it was grief for a version of yourself you had hidden inside another person, and the loss of that person was the loss of a piece of your interior life. You are allowed to grieve that too. The image mattered. It contained something real about you. What it did not contain was another person. The other person, the actual one, with their ordinary human limits and their specific and unrepeatable way of existing, was always just behind the image. Some of them are still there. Some of them, if you looked without needing them to be anything in particular, would surprise you. Not by being better than the projected version, by being more interesting, by being actually, genuinely, irreducibly themselves. And that, the encounter with what is actually there, is the only place any of this was ever going to happen. The grief of seeing someone clearly is real. Let it be real. It is grief for the love you aimed at someone who was partly fictional, and for the time spent defending the fiction, and for the versions of people you lost when the fiction finally dissolved. That grief has weight. It deserves to be felt. Do not skip it in the rush to arrive at the cleaner conclusion. But on the other side of the grief, not instead of it, not past it, but on the other side, is something that deserves a name. The specific freedom of a person who is no longer maintaining a story. Who can look at someone without needing them to confirm anything. Who can be disappointed without being shattered. Who can be surprised without being undone. Who can love without needing the love to be the love they constructed in the private theater of their own longing. Seeing people clearly is not the same as seeing them coldly. The people who stop romanticizing don't love less, they love more honestly. This channel exists for that kind of honesty. If that's what you're building toward, you're already in the right place.